Thank you for joining. My name is Michael LeBeau. I'm a Senior Systems Engineer for Quest Software. Today we'll discover the Enterprise Reporter requirements. Those requirements will include the definition of Enterprise Reporter, a discussion of licensing, hardware and software requirements, data motion and ports, data collection, service accounts, and the installation requirements. Enterprise Reporter is a centralized data collection and storage solution which utilizes Microsoft SQL Database as its data store. With Enterprise Reporter, users will be able to ensure compliance with reports and industry standards, including HIPAA and GDPR. You can monitor security policies to detect violations or security misconfigurations, and you'll be able to streamline auditing by providing comprehensive reports with easy access to security and configuration information for all audiences. Enterprise Reporter can be licensed in several different ways. There are individual modules for Active Directory, Windows Server, SQL, File Storage Analysis, Exchange, Microsoft 365, or the all-inclusive Enterprise Reporter suite. Enterprise Reporter is typically sold a la carte. Of course, with 3 different modules or more, the suite is more price competitive. Enterprise Reporter Server requires to be run on a Windows Server from 2016 through 2022. We request that you have at least 8 gigs of RAM, recommended 16, at least 2 GHz processor with 2 cores, and ample hard disk space for the software and any caching that we may require. Of course, the space required on the SQL database server will be different. We do have a database size estimator available for you if you'd like to try and calculate those values. The Enterprise Reporter consoles, of which there's 2, the Configuration Manager and Report Manager, each have the same requirements. At least a Windows 10, 11, or Windows Server machine with at least 16 gigs of RAM available and a 2 GHz processor with 2 cores. We do require a minimum of 20 gig of disk space for the Report Manager. Each of the Enterprise Reporter nodes, or agents as they're often called, can be run on a Windows Server from 2016 through 2022 with a minimum of 16 gigs of RAM. Each of those nodes do cache quite a bit of data, so the more RAM that you can provide this machine, the better and faster that it can operate. The processor is a 2 GHz processor required, preferably with 4 cores, as there's a lot of processing activity done at the node. And of course, the hard disk space is a minimum of 10 gigs with a possible extra 90 gigs for collecting data. The SQL Server requirements. We can connect to any SQL Server from 2014 through 2022 with a minimum of 16 gigs of RAM. We do recommend that your SQL Server have at least 24 gigs of RAM for proper performance with 2 GHz processors with at least 4 cores. 100 gig of disk space is required, although Enterprise Reporter can consume much more disk space than that, depending on how often and what data you are collecting. Additional software requirements for the system is the Microsoft.NET Framework 4.8. You do need Microsoft Excel to read some of the reports if they're produced. Microsoft 365 Excel and or PowerShell 3.0 can also be leveraged to read the data produced by Enterprise Reporter. We do have services that are required, such as the .NET TCP report sharing, remote registry, SQL Server browser service for SQL discovery, and the Windows management instrumentation. The data motion in Enterprise Reporter is fairly simple. It does have a couple of components in which the data must move between. The Enterprise Reporter server is the core of the system, and it does read and write data to the SQL Server. The Configuration Manager is where the configurations are performed in Enterprise Reporter. The discovery nodes perform all the work, and the Report Manager is where the users will be able to pull data from the system. To make it easy to understand, I've added a graphic to this so you can see the data motion in between the different components of Enterprise Reporter. Of course, this graphic and all of the information you're about to see is in the installation and configuration guide that's available with your software download. Enterprise Reporter does need certain ports for each of its components. Here we've detailed all of the ports that will be required what the uses of those ports are and which component of Enterprise Reporter is going to require that port. It is necessary that you talk with the networking team in making sure these ports are available during the installation process. Once Enterprise Reporter is installed and there will be discoveries performed across the network, additional ports will be required. These too are documented in the installation and deployment guide for Enterprise Reporter. Collecting data from on-prem sources is fairly easy to do. The data is collected directly from the nodes, typically using the node service account. However, if you would like to use a different account to collect the data, you can specify an account. And of course, for each of the components of data that you are going to collect, each one of those components has their own requirements for security for that account. Please be aware of all of these requirements going forward for your implementation, because if you do not have the appropriate permissions or an account with those permissions to collect the data will not be collected. Collecting data from Entra ID in Azure is a little bit more problematic these days, as Microsoft is constantly changing the security on those accounts and what's required. For Entra ID in Azure, collections can use one or more accounts for data collections, although all collection accounts must have MFA enabled on them. Each one of those accounts has to be brought into the Enterprise Reporter Configuration Manager and authenticated. Teams and Exchange in version 3.5.2 will use certificate authentication. SharePoint and OneDrive require special permissions for data collection, and Azure resources cannot be currently collected under Microsoft's collection rules. A warning to this, we are moving toward certificate-based authentication, as this is going to be Microsoft's de facto standard for gathering data in the Microsoft ecosystem. As they slowly roll out the APIs for that, we will build out collection components for that. So make sure that as you're using Enterprise Reporter, if there is an update, it will behoove you to be most current in the software. For large environments, you have to think of the network topology before the nodes are deployed. If the network is site-based with servers with data to collect in each site, it is best to place a node in that site so that it collects the data locally, caches, and then bursts the data directly to the SQL Server, reducing the number of hops the data must make to get into the database. All of this is dependent on the type of collections you're performing, the size of the collections to be formed, and the location of the SQL Server in the environment. So all of this does need to be brought into consideration prior to installation. The service accounts are important. The Enterprise Server must have its own service account with local admin access. The discovery nodes must have certain access rights if you're going to use the nodes for collecting data. Otherwise, you may use alternate accounts. For cloud data access, alternate accounts are mandatory, so you must make sure that each one of those accounts meet the requirements for each component that you are collecting. The report manager and configuration manager do not need a service account, but the operator needs to be a domain account with local admin privileges on the servers that are hosting these components. Of course, with the report manager, you can always run as administrator. And as a general note, all service accounts should have strong passwords, follow your organizational policies, and for cloud accounts, ensure that MFA is configured if required by your security policies. Of course, for our purposes, MFA must be enabled. The security requirements for the installation are pretty simple. The logged on user must have local administrator rights. This would be considered the installer account. The account should have permissions to install the software and configure services on that server. Further, the logged on user must have permissions to create and manage security groups in Active Directory. If the user does not, those groups can be created in advance. And of course, if the names have changed, you can change the names to match in the installation process. Of course, we will create at least 3 groups in Active Directory, typically in the user's container. although if they're being created or staged ahead of time, they can be anywhere within Active Directory. The logged on user must also have permissions to create databases on the SQL Server. Again, you can pre-stage a database and give the user DBO on that database, and they can leverage an existing unstructured database that an enterprise reporter will then configure. If the database is being created during installation, the logged on user is automatically added to the security groups with full access to Enterprise Reporter. Keep in mind that role-based security is implemented to restrict access to sensitive data in Enterprise Reporter. Of course, the installer will have full access to Enterprise Reporter.